Mabel Finch leaned slightly to her right, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked at the gentleman she had never spoken to before tonight. The long dining table of the DuPont estate stretched out before them, filled with the loud chatter of Tarrytown high society and the heavy scent of roasted meats. She did not wait for the gentleman to look back at her before she slid her hand beneath the white linen tablecloth, pressing her palm against his knuckles. His skin was remarkably cold, colder than the silver ice buckets at the center of the room, but she did not pull away. She could see Thomas Reed walking toward their side of the table, his eyes locked on her with the same smooth smile he had used for 6 months to destroy her life. If Thomas found her sitting alone and defenseless tonight, he would finish the ruin he started, ensuring she never showed her face in New York society again. Across the crowded room, Thomas had already caught the eye of several prominent guests, gesturing toward Mabel as he walked. He had spent the last half-year convincing every family from Tarrytown to Manhattan that Mabel was an unstable, vengeful woman who had broken his heart without cause. The truth was far simpler, but the truth did not travel as quickly as a well-crafted lie, and Thomas was a master of repetition. In another 10 seconds, he would reach her chair, and every pair of eyes in the room would turn to watch the confrontation. If the pale gentleman beside her pushed her hand away or called for the servants, Mabel would become the evening's laughingstock. If he accepted her desperate touch, they would both be bound to a massive lie born of pure panic. For one long, agonizing second, the gentleman did not move or speak. He slowly turned his head, revealing sharp features, short white hair that caught the candlelight, and skin so pale it seemed made of winter stone. Rumors in the northern hills whispered that Gideon Frost was not entirely human, that he was the hidden king of a people who ruled the dark. But Mabel had ignored the old myths until now. Gideon looked down at her trembling fingers, then turned his palm upward, intertwining his long, cold fingers with hers in a steady grip. When Thomas finally reached the table and opened his mouth to speak, Gideon smiled with a calm that bordered on total indifference. He looked up at the intruder, his voice low and smooth as it carried across the immediate area, cutting through the noise. He said quite clearly, "My dear, you have kept your fiancé waiting far too long." The single sentence dropped into the crowded dining room more effectively than if someone had shattered a crystal wine glass against the floor. Conversations died out in a wave, starting from their end of the table and moving rapidly toward the hostess, Mrs. Beatrice DuPont, sitting at the far end beneath a heavy iron chandelier, paused with her soup spoon halfway to her mouth, her eyes widening in delight. A secret engagement between the most reclusive gentleman in the county and the woman everyone had been whispering about was the greatest gossip of the year. Within less than a minute, the news began its journey from guest to guest, until even the older gentlemen near the doors were turning to look at Mabel with newfound curiosity. Thomas Reed froze in his tracks, his posture stiffening so quickly that his coat buttons strained against his vest. The easy confidence he had carried across the room broke apart, leaving his face pale and his hands clenched tightly by his sides. He had fully expected to find Mabel isolated, forced to endure his polite insults, while the rest of the room watched her suffer in silence. Instead, she was sitting hand in hand with a man whose wealth and family history predated the town itself, a man who spoke as though they had been promised to one another for months. Thomas tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat as Gideon raised his glass in a silent, icy toast. Mabel could barely feel the chair beneath her, her breathing shallow as she tried to comprehend what had just occurred. She had expected Gideon to reject her, or at the very least, to ask her to leave the table so he could avoid a scene. She had never imagined that the mysterious white-haired man would validate her lie without asking for a single word of explanation first. Beneath the heavy cloth, his hand remained perfectly still and cool, acting as an anchor that stopped the visible shaking of her own arm. Without shifting his gaze from the front of the room, he leaned an inch closer to her, his breath cool against her ear. "If you continue to look like a ghost, Mabel," he murmured softly, "the rest of these people will realize we are playing a game." She turned to look at him properly, her eyes wide with lingering fear. His expression was entirely unbothered, as though they were discussing the afternoon weather rather than committing a social crime that could ruin them both. "Smile for the crowd," he added in that same quiet, rhythmic tone, because engaged couples generally look happy rather than terrified. Despite the terrible weight in her chest, the sheer dryness of his remark brought a faint, genuine curve to her lips. She managed to nod, just as Mrs. DuPont rose slightly from her seat, calling down the length of the long table with a bright, ringing laugh. "Mr. Frost, we had all assumed you intended to remain a bachelor in your hills forever, but it seems Miss Finch has achieved what every mother in the state failed to do." A wave of polite laughter followed the hostess's words, every guest waiting to see how the quiet man would respond to the public teasing. Gideon inclined his head with an effortless grace that made his white hair shimmer under the lamps. "Her regular visits to the Northern Valley have always possessed a remarkable way of changing my mind," he replied smoothly. The answer was brilliant, neither confirming a specific timeline nor denying the lady's assumptions, yet it gave the crowd exactly what they wanted to believe. By the time the servants began clearing the soup plates for the main course, the fake engagement had become an accepted fact in the minds of Tarrytown's elite. Mabel looked down at her plate, her heart slowing down as she realized the immediate danger had passed, though a much larger problem had just begun. 6 months before this evening, rooms like the DuPont dining hall had welcomed Mabel Finch with open doors and genuine smiles. Invitations to afternoon teas and summer lawn parties had arrived at her family's small cottage almost every day of the week. Older ladies had praised her gentle manners, young gentlemen had sought her hand for dances, and neighbors had openly wondered which family she might join through marriage. Then Thomas Reed had rewritten her entire existence, before she could even gather the strength to understand what he was doing. According to the stories he spread through every parlor, Mabel had led him on for a year, demanded an expensive ring, and then rejected him in a fit of pride and temper. The jilted young man had earned the sympathy of every family in the valley, while the unpredictable woman was quietly excluded from the guest lists. The truth of the matter had vanished entirely beneath the weight of Thomas's constant repetition to anyone who would listen. Thomas had discovered by accident that Mabel's family inheritance would pass completely into her own hands upon her 25 by 25th birthday, which was only a few weeks away. He had spoken of deep affection, while secretly courting another young woman in New York City, whose family fortune doubled what Mabel would ever inherit. Mabel had found his love letters to the city heiress by pure chance, ended their relationship that very hour, and expected the broken courtship to remain a private matter between them. Instead, Thomas had moved quickly, presenting himself as the broken-hearted victim before Mabel had even fully recovered from the shock of his betrayal. She could have fought back against his lies, because she still possessed his old notes, knew the dates of his secret trips, and remembered their exact conversations. Yet, every word she spoke against Thomas would have traveled directly to his younger cousin, William Reed, who had recently fallen in love with Mabel's younger sister, Hazel. Their courtship was still new, fragile enough that any loud family argument or public scandal would have caused William's strict parents to pull him away forever. Hazel had known very little happiness since their father passed away, and Mabel could not bear the thought of being the reason her sister's joy disappeared. So she had accepted the cold looks, accepted the invitations that stopped coming, and accepted the way ladies lowered their voices whenever she walked into a shop. She had carried the heavy burden in silence, because she believed Hazel deserved a bright future, untouched by the dirt Thomas was throwing. Now, sitting beside the pale gentleman, Mabel realized just how exhausted she had become from carrying that weight entirely by herself. Gideon seemed to notice the change in her posture before she even drew her next breath. "You have departed from the room again," he remarked quietly, while a loud argument about local horses broke out further down the table. She looked at him, her eyes blinking in confusion as she tried to pull herself out of the old memories. "Only in your mind," he clarified, his dark eyes fixed on her face with a strange, piercing intensity. "Whatever caused you to take my hand has taken your thoughts many times before tonight." She hesitated, looking at the silver fork in her hand, wondering how much she should say to a man she did not know. They were strangers, and by all rights, they should have remained strangers until the dinner concluded. Yet there was a peculiar comfort in speaking to someone who had accepted her massive lie without a single second of judgment or hesitation. "That gentleman across the room is Thomas Reed," she said in a tiny voice, keeping her eyes strictly away from the fireplace where Thomas stood. "He truly believes that I have wronged him in the past." Gideon's gaze drifted lazily across the white tablecloth until it rested briefly on Thomas's rigid form by the wall. "No," the white-haired man replied after a short pause, his voice dropping into a lower register. "He believes that everyone else believes you wronged him, and that is a very different thing." The distinction hit her harder than she expected, showing an understanding that half the town had failed to grasp over the last 6 months. The dinner courses changed one after another, and with every new platter came another sharp question from the curious guests nearby. Mrs. Higgins, a sharp-eyed woman who loved secrets, leaned across her plate with an eager expression. "Miss Finch, how did you manage to hide Mr. Frost from us for so many months?" An older gentleman near the center of the table laughed, shaking his head. "More importantly, how did a man who hates our parties manage to stay hidden in plain sight?" The questions began to multiply before Mabel could form a sensible lie to satisfy them. Where had they met during the winter? How long had the courtship lasted? And why had no one seen them walking together in the valley? Gideon never appeared rushed or flustered by the attention, answering the First Lady with absolute calm. "I discovered very early in our acquaintance that Mabel prefers quiet walks to public spectacles," he said. Several guests nodded their heads in agreement, as it sounded exactly like something the reserved master of the Northern Valley would say. Another lady smiled wisely, tapping her chin with a lace fan. "Then the courtship must have been wonderfully private for both of you." Gideon glanced at Mabel, a tiny spark of dark amusement hiding in his eyes. "It was private enough that even I occasionally wondered if it was truly happening," he murmured. A soft ripple of laughter spread around the table, and Mabel realized he was leaving open spaces in the conversation for her to enter without trapping her in lies. She gathered her courage, smoothing her skirt with her free hand. "Mr. Frost has always maintained an unfortunate habit of believing that absolute silence answers every question," she said aloud. Gideon looked at her, his expression shifting into something that looked remarkably like real affection. "Only because your silence has generally been much kinder than other people's long speeches," he replied. The exchange felt so natural that several older couples smiled at them, and Mrs. DuPont declared they already sounded like a pair that had been wed for a decade. The dinner finally ended, and the guests began to move toward the large drawing room, where the musicians were setting up their instruments near the piano. Mabel stayed close to Gideon's side, her hand resting lightly on his dark coat sleeve, still amazed by the smooth texture of his clothing and the coldness radiating from him. The transition from the dining room had been loud, but as they reached the wider space, Thomas Reed stepped into their path once more. He held a glass of dark wine, his fingers gripping the stem so hard his knuckles were white. "Forgive my lingering curiosity, Mr. Frost," Thomas said, his voice dripping with a false politeness that made Mabel's stomach turn. "Tarrytown prides itself on knowing every piece of news before the morning milk arrives, so it is quite remarkable that none of us noticed this courtship." The surrounding guests slowed their steps, their ears turning toward the three of them as the tension in the room rose. Gideon regarded the younger man with a cool, unblinking stare that seemed to look right through him. "That is simply because Tarrytown usually mistakes loud noise for actual observation," the white-haired man replied mildly. A few gentlemen near the fireplace chuckled into their glasses, clearly enjoying the quick shutdown of Thomas's prying. Thomas's smile tightened until his lips were a thin line. "Then perhaps we have all been unusually inattentive these past months," he muttered. "It happens to the best of us," Gideon replied, "especially when people become far too interested in stories that flatter their own expectations." The answer sounded completely harmless to the casual listener, yet Mabel could see that Thomas understood the sharp edge hidden beneath the words. For the first time since his lies had begun, someone had challenged his control of the narrative, without making a loud scene or an open accusation. Thomas looked at Gideon with a new sense of caution, realizing he was not dealing with a confused stranger, but a man entirely comfortable standing between him and his victim. The evening might have fallen apart if Gideon had demanded an explanation right there, but he waited until the crowd moved toward the music. Only when the space around them became clear did Gideon guide Mabel toward a corner near the tall glass doors leading to the dark gardens. "Now," he said, his voice dropping low enough that the piano notes covered his words, "I believe my new fiancé owes me the very beginning of the truth." Mabel closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the cool air from the gardens slipping through the cracks in the door. "Only the beginning," she whispered, looking up at his pale face. "The rest of the story can wait until fewer people are trying to overhear our conversation." She looked at him truly, seeing past the wealthy name that intimidated the town, noticing the strange patience in his eyes. "You should know that I involved you in this disaster without your permission," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Gideon nodded, his white hair catching the shadows of the corner. "You did," he agreed. "Your reputation in this town might suffer terribly because of my problems," she continued. "It might," he said, "and yet I agreed to the story anyway." Mabel looked down at his hand, which was still resting near her own on the dark wood of the side table. "Why did you agree so quickly, when you had every right to expose my lie to the whole room?" Gideon rested his fingers lightly on the polished wood, his voice as steady as it had been from the first impossible second under the table. "I agreed, because frightened people rarely take the time to invent elaborate, greedy schemes," he said softly. "They simply reach for the nearest door they believe might still be open to them." His dark eyes met hers with a quiet, supernatural certainty that made her breath catch. "You did not sit beside me tonight because you wished to deceive this society, Miss Finch. You sat beside me because you honestly believed you had nowhere else to go in this room." Before she could find the words to answer him, Mrs. DuPont's voice echoed across the room, announcing that the dancing would begin in 5 minutes. Excited conversations immediately broke out among the young people, and several servants began moving the smaller chairs out of the way. Thomas remained by the fireplace, watching them in a troubled silence, as the social power he had held for 6 months slowly shifted away from him. Mabel realized with a mixture of immense relief and sharp alarm that the lie was no longer just her own desperate attempt to survive the night. It was surviving because Gideon Frost had chosen to carry it beside her, and for reasons she did not understand, he had no intention of letting her face the next hour alone. The social questioning began before Mabel and Gideon could take 3 steps away from the dark corner of the drawing room. Mrs. Higgins reached them first, her eyes wide with the fierce determination of a woman who considered another person's private joy an absolute challenge. "Where did you two first meet?" she demanded, her notebook practically visible in her eager expression. "How long has this been kept from us, and why was my family not informed of the news?" 2 other older ladies gathered right behind her, while a young gentleman abandoned his drink near the wall to listen to the answers. Mabel felt the familiar panic rushing back into her throat, her fingers tightening against Gideon's sleeve until her gloves strained. A single lie, spoken in a moment of pure desperation, was something she could handle, but a full courtship required months of details, places, and shared memories. One careless word or an incorrect date would shatter the illusion and destroy whatever safety they had managed to build. Gideon seemed to feel the sharp tension passing through her arm because he placed his own cold hand over hers, securing her grip. "We met at the winter musical held at the courthouse back in January," he said without a single second of hesitation. Mabel looked up at him in surprise, remembering that the town had indeed held a massive musical performance during the first week of January. Half the population of the valley had attended the event, making it a brilliant choice because no one could possibly remember every single introduction made that night. "You hated that musical, Mr. Frost," a gentleman remarked, as he walked past them with a tray of punch. "I distinctly remember you leaving before the final singers took the stage." "I left because Miss Finch had already stepped out into the snow," Gideon replied smoothly, bringing a round of delighted murmurs from the ladies. Mabel stared at him, her mouth opening slightly before she caught herself and forced a small, knowing smile to match his performance. Mrs. Higgins turned her sharp gaze onto Mabel, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And what did the Master of the Valley say when he first approached you in the hall?" she asked. Mabel knew it was a direct trap, designed to see if their stories would match under pressure. She took one quick look at Gideon's unreadable face, noting the slight tilt of his white brow, then leaned forward. "Very little," she admitted honestly, causing the ladies to laugh again. "He asked whether I was enjoying the violins, and when I said I was not, he stood beside me in total silence for 20 minutes, she continued, gaining confidence. He apparently believed the courtship had already begun right then. "It had begun," Gideon countered, his voice full of a dry restraint that played perfectly for the crowd. "I was making excellent progress during those 20 minutes, despite the fact that you had not yet learned my family name. That was a minor difficulty in my plans, not a total defeat." The guests laughed loudly at the exchange, and the tight knot inside Mabel's chest finally loosened into a sense of safety. Their invented history had found a beautiful, natural rhythm, with Gideon providing the solid foundation and Mabel adding the human warmth to make it believable. He protected her from the impossible questions without making her look helpless, and she discovered she could strengthen the lie rather than just hide behind his back. When asked why there had been no public announcement before tonight, Mabel explained that Mr. Frost wished to be absolutely certain of her feelings. Gideon looked down at her, his pale skin glowing in the lamplight. "Miss Finch wished to be certain," he corrected gently. "You required no certainty from me," she asked, tilting her head. "Only a bit of encouragement," he murmured. "And did you receive it?" "Not nearly as quickly as you now imply," Mabel smiled, and the crowd absolutely adored the quick banter. Thomas Reed watched every single reaction from his spot near the heavy curtains, his face turning darker as the night wore on. He had spent 6 long months teaching the people of Tarrytown to see Mabel as a desperate, rejected woman who was losing her mind after a failed relationship. Now, those exact same people were standing in a circle, watching her tease a wealthy man who seemed entirely content to be treated that way. The massive contradiction was becoming incredibly dangerous to Thomas's own position in the town's high society. He stepped forward, pushing through the small circle of guests with a loud, false laugh that interrupted the light conversation. "January," he repeated, staring directly at Mabel, with a cold challenge in his eyes. "How very fortunate for both of you." Miss Finch was not known for attending many public events after the Christmas holidays passed. Mabel felt the sharp sting of the reminder, knowing Thomas remembered exactly where she had been because he had still been pretending to love her then. Before she could let the old hurt show on her face, Gideon answered for her, his cold voice cutting through the air like a winter wind. "She attended quite enough events to meet me, Mr. Reed, and that seems to be the only number that matters tonight." Thomas's smile turned into a hard grimace for a split second, before he managed to smooth it away with another drink. "Yet the courthouse hall was exceptionally crowded that night," he continued, his eyes darting between the two of them. "It seems rather remarkable that none of the family friends noticed your sudden interest in her." "You did not notice it," Gideon replied, his dark eyes fixed on Thomas with a terrifying stillness. "That is not the same thing as the rest of the world failing to see." A heavy silence followed the remark, several older gentlemen looking down at their boots to hide the amusement they felt at Thomas's expense. Thomas's face flushed red, realizing he had been pushed back twice in front of the most important families in the county. Mabel saw the anger in his eyes, the same cold calculation she had once mistaken for charm during their own courtship. Gideon saw it too, though he simply turned back to Mabel, as if Thomas had vanished from the room entirely. "His Grace was extremely discreet during the winter," Mabel added to the remaining ladies, keeping the story alive. "I stood beside you for 20 minutes without saying a single memorable word," Gideon joked softly, his hand pressing gently against her arm. "I asked about the music, and you asked if the night was over. I was remarkably nervous this time around." Even Mabel laughed at that, a short, genuine sound that escaped her lips before she could stop it. The soft sound altered something between them in that crowded room, warming Gideon's dark eyes in a way that the guests immediately noticed. Thomas saw it as well, his fist clenching around his glass as he realized his power was slipping away entirely. For the next 15 minutes, the questions continued to come, but they no longer felt like dangerous weapons aimed at Mabel's life. Together, they invented a beautiful courtship, one small answer at a time, building a world that felt completely real to everyone listening. They had met in the winter cold, seen each other again at the small library exhibition, and she had refused to walk with him because he arrived without a proper carriage. He claimed she had left him standing by the stone steps for 40 minutes, out of pure stubbornness, while she insisted it had been only 20. When someone asked where the proposal had occurred, Gideon stated it happened in the quiet library because he believed books would prevent any loud interruptions. They did not prevent it, Gideon grumbled with a small smile. A servant entered with a fresh bucket of coal right as I started to speak. And you stopped talking completely, Mabel laughed, because a proper proposal deserves absolute privacy from the household. You had only managed 3 words before the man walked in. They were very important words, Gideon countered, his voice softening just enough for her to hear. One of them was your name, which was the most important part of the 3. The surrounding audience absolutely adored the story, finding the imperfect details far more convincing than a rehearsed, grand declaration would have been. There was no sweeping moonlight romance, no grand poetry designed to impress the town, just awkward silences and small disagreements that made the history feel alive. Mabel began to recognize Gideon's silent signals as they spoke to the crowd, reading the movement of his white brow and the pressure of his cool fingers. A slight shift in his weight meant a difficult question was coming from the side, while a tightening of his grip warned her that Thomas was listening closely. She responded with her own small movements, letting him know when he was inventing too much or when an answer touched a real part of her past. When the crowd finally shifted toward the piano to watch a young lady begin a song, Gideon guided Mabel toward the open terrace windows. The cool night air rushed over her warm face, bringing the scent of pine needles and damp earth from the northern hills where Gideon lived. For the first time since she had taken his hand at the dinner table, there were no curious eyes staring directly at them. Gideon looked down at her, the dark amusement completely gone from his face, replaced by a serious stillness. "Tell me about Thomas Reed," he said simply. Mabel's first instinct was to pull her hand away and run back into the crowded room, to hide behind the silence she had kept for 6 months. She had refused to tell the story to anyone else, even to the few friends who might have stood by her side during the worst of the scandal. But Gideon had placed his ancient name beside hers, without knowing the truth, defending her in a room where doing so carried a massive social cost. She owed him far more than another quick evasion, or a clever lie meant for the town gossips. "He courted me for my family inheritance," she said, the words feeling heavy and cold as they left her lips. "It passes fully into my control when I turn 25 next month, and Thomas discovered the exact amount before I even knew he had asked the bank," she continued. "He spoke of a long marriage while secretly writing to another woman whose fortune was twice the size of mine. I found the letters by accident, ended our plans that same day, and expected him to leave the valley in peace. Instead, he hurried to every parlor in Tarrytown to tell everyone I had lost my mind and ruined him." Gideon's jaw tightened, his pale skin looking almost sharp in the moonlight, though his voice remained perfectly controlled. "You could have corrected the story easily if you held his letters," he observed. "You had the proof to ruin his name in a single morning." "Yes," Mabel whispered, looking back through the glass at the brightly lit drawing room where her sister Hazel was not yet present. "Then why did you choose to remain silent and let him destroy your life?" "My younger sister Hazel is deeply attached to Thomas's cousin, William Reed, and their family is incredibly strict about public behavior," she explained, her voice cracking slightly. "If I had exposed Thomas publicly, the argument would have consumed both our households, and William's parents would have forced him to leave her. Hazel has known so much sadness since our father died, and I could not let myself be the reason her only joy was taken away. Gideon was silent for a long time, his white hair catching the silver light of the moon. Mabel braced herself for his disapproval, expecting him to call her foolish for sacrificing her own life for a sister's romance. Instead, the white-haired man looked at her with a deep, quiet understanding that felt older than the hills themselves. "Does Hazel know what you surrendered for her sake?" he asked softly. "No," Mabel said, "and neither does Thomas, though he suspects why I choose to stay quiet under his insults." "Then he has used your deep love for your sister as a sharp weapon against you," Gideon stated, his voice full of a cold anger that was not directed at her. The absolute accuracy of his words made her look away, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "You protected your sister's future by giving Thomas full possession of your good name," Gideon continued, his hand moving to rest gently on the stone railing. "I protected her happiness," Mabel insisted, looking back at him. "Perhaps," the white-haired man murmured, "but you speak as though those were the only choices available to you in this town." "They were the only choices that did not risk destroying her life," Mabel said, her defense rising up. "No," Gideon said firmly but quietly. "They were the only choices you believed you were permitted to make by yourself." She turned back to him sharply, expecting to see a judgmental look on his pale face, but he only looked troubled on her behalf. "I do not mock what you did for your family," he added, his dark eyes holding hers in the moonlight. "You accepted a terrible humiliation because you loved someone else more than you loved being vindicated by the crowd. That is never a weakness, Mabel, but sacrifice becomes an incredibly dangerous thing when everyone begins to expect it from the same person every time." Mabel had never heard her painful decision described in such a human, understanding way by anyone in the town. High society called her cruel, Thomas called her unstable, and Hazel, completely unaware of the truth, thought Mabel simply wished to forget the broken relationship. Gideon alone saw both the quiet courage it took to stay silent and the massive cost she had paid every single day since winter. "You make it sound incredibly foolish," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the piano inside. "No," he replied softly, "I make it sound incredibly lonely." For one long moment, the loud drawing room behind them seemed to vanish entirely into the dark trees of the garden. Mabel did not feel examined by a cold critic. She did not feel measured against the rumors Thomas had spread. She simply felt seen for the first time in half a year. The feeling frightened her far more than the town's ridicule ever could, because it required her to open a heart she had locked away tightly. She forced herself to look away from his pale features, asking the single question that had been growing since the dinner began. "Why did you truly help me tonight?" Gideon looked out at the dark hills rising in the distance, his white hair stark against the night sky. "You already know why I began," he said. "Because you appeared cornered by a pack of wolves at that table." "And why are you still helping me now that the dinner is over?" she pressed. He was silent for so long that she wondered if he would ever answer her, the piano music inside changing to a slower, sweeter tune. "Because every lady introduced to me for the last 10 years has arrived with a long list of social advantages," he said. "They speak of my family name and my estate as though the man carrying them is nothing more than a convenient contract," he continued, his voice full of a long-held bitterness. "My parents married for precisely those reasons of property and duty, spending 30 years in the same massive house without speaking a single word unless a servant was in the room. Their life was praised as respectable by the town, but it was a cold prison, polished until no one outside could see the iron bars. Tonight, you took my hand not for a title, but for safety, and that is the first honest touch I have felt in a century." By midnight, the grand party had begun to wind down, but the guests showed very little desire to leave the DuPont drawing room. Mabel stood near the center of the room, her hand still resting on Gideon's arm as they watched a late arrival hurry through the wide front doors. It was Hazel Finch, her cheeks bright red from the cold night air, as she apologized to Mrs. DuPont for the long delay with their old carriage. Hazel lifted her eyes to search the crowd, freezing instantly as she saw her older sister standing hand in hand with the white-haired master of the Northern Valley. She heard a nearby lady whisper the words, "secret engagement," and the remaining color drained from Hazel's young face in a second. Mabel's heart stopped, knowing her sister knew absolutely nothing about the desperate lies she had told at the dinner table. A single confused question, or a loud denial from Hazel, would destroy the whole illusion in front of the entire town. Hazel crossed the polished floor quickly, her eyes darting from Gideon's calm face to Thomas Reed, who was still standing rigidly by the dark fireplace. She noticed the deep bitterness in Thomas's posture and the sudden, defensive strength in her older sister's face. Hazel had always been remarkably observant, and the truth began to appear slowly behind her clear eyes as she looked at them. "I had not realized congratulations were in order tonight, sister," Hazel said carefully, her voice steady despite the surprise. Gideon bowed to the young woman with an effortless courtesy that looked entirely natural. "Miss Hazel," he said. She returned the greeting, then fixed Mabel with a long, intense look that asked 1,000 questions without making a single sound. "Are you protecting me from him again?" the look seemed to say. Mabel could only answer with a tiny, pleading movement of her eyes, hoping her sister would understand the danger they were in. Pain flickered briefly across Hazel's face before she smoothed it away, turning a bright smile toward the surrounding guests. "I only hope that Mr. Frost appreciates just how incredibly stubborn my sister can be when she sets her mind to something," Hazel said aloud. Gideon answered without a single second of hesitation, his dark eyes warming as he looked down at Mabel. "I have already begun to discover that trait tonight," he said, causing several ladies to laugh warmly. The immediate danger passed, the lie saved by Hazel's quick thinking. But as soon as the sisters found themselves alone by the glass doors, Hazel caught Mabel's hands in a tight grip. "What have you done, Mabel?" she whispered, her eyes shiny with sudden tears. "Exactly what I had to do to survive the dinner," Mabel replied, her voice low. "This engagement is not a real thing." "No," Hazel said, looking back at Thomas. "Then why is he looking at you with so much anger tonight?" Mabel said nothing, turning her head away because she could not bring herself to break her sister's heart with the truth about William's family. Hazel's expression slowly shifted from deep confusion to a sharp, sudden heartbreak as the pieces of the last 6 months fell into place. "You never defended yourself against his awful stories," she murmured, her voice trembling. "You let the town call you cruel because of me and William." Mabel looked down at their joined hands. "You knew about his family?" Hazel asked. "Not until this exact moment, but I am not blind, Mabel." Before Mabel could offer a comforting word, Thomas Reed pushed his way through the crowd once more, followed by 3 older gentlemen who held positions of authority in the town. "Your Grace," Thomas said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the entire room as the music stopped. "Forgive my persistence on this happy night, but since you and Miss Finch are to be wed, I assume you have discussed the true reason her last courtship ended so poorly." The surrounding chatter died out instantly, every eye turning back to the center of the floor. Mabel felt her stomach tighten into a hard knot, the old, familiar humiliation rising up to choke her as Thomas stepped closer. Surely any honorable gentleman would wish to understand why his future bride abandoned a promised relationship without a single word of explanation. Thomas continued, his smile sharp and nasty. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks, but no one stepped forward to stop him, their desire for a scandal far greater than their manners. Gideon regarded the younger man with a calm, freezing stare that made the room feel 20 degrees colder. "I know quite enough about the matter, Mr. Reed," Gideon replied, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. Thomas laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Enough? Is it enough to trust a woman who changes her mind like the spring wind? It is quite enough to trust Miss Finch's character, far more than I trust rumors repeated by those who benefit from them," Gideon stated clearly. The words dropped like iron weights into the room, causing Mrs. Higgins to gasp slightly. "Surely that is rather generous of you, Mr. Frost," Thomas sneered, his face turning red under the lamps. "No," Gideon countered, his white hair gleaming as he stepped fully in front of Mabel. It is simply far easier than believing that a gentleman who was truly wronged would spend 6 long months ensuring every single parlor in the county heard only his version of the story. A loud murmur broke out among the guests, several older men turning to look at Thomas with sudden suspicion in their eyes. "I never visited every parlor," Thomas defended himself far too quickly, his voice rising in panic as he realized what he had just admitted to the crowd. He stopped speaking instantly, but the damage had already been done in front of his neighbors. Mrs. DuPont frowned, stepping forward with a thoughtful look on her face. "Mr. Reed, I distinctly recall you telling my cousins the entire story at the library gathering back in February," she said coldly. Another gentleman nodded his head. "And you told the same story to the men at the bank clerk's office," he added. Thomas attempted to form another smooth explanation, but every sentence he spoke produced another small inconsistency in his timeline. For the first time in 6 months, the people of Terrytown were actually examining his words instead of just repeating them to the next neighbor. Mabel watched the sudden collapse of his reputation with a sense of utter astonishment, her hand gripping Gideon's arm for support. The white-haired master of the valley had not exposed Thomas with a dramatic speech. He had simply invited the rest of the room to use their own minds, which proved infinitely more devastating. The grand party finally came to a complete end as the remaining carriages lined up along the dark stone driveway of the DuPont estate. The older guests departed with quiet, thoughtful expressions, their conversations about Mabel and Thomas completely changed by the events of the evening. Mabel stood in the quiet entrance hall, the heavy oak doors opened to the cool night air as the last lanterns were blown out by the servants. She turned to look at Gideon, his white hair silver in the moonlight, his pale skin looking entirely calm after the long storm. "Our 2 hours have ended, Mr. Frost," she said softly, her voice echoing slightly in the empty hallway. "Thank you for giving me back my dignity in front of this town. I shall never forget the kindness you showed a cornered stranger tonight." She lowered her eyes to her shoes. "But I cannot allow this massive lie to follow you back to your hills. Tomorrow morning I will write a letter to Mrs. DuPont explaining that we have broken our short agreement, so your family name remains clear of my problems." She expected him to nod in relief, or perhaps to offer a polite farewell before heading back to his dark valley in the north. Instead, Gideon studied her face with the same deep, patient calm that had kept her safe through the long dinner. "May I ask you one honest question before you choose to sacrifice your life again?" he asked quietly. "Is ending this engagement what you genuinely want for yourself, Mabel? Or is it simply the next hard duty you have assigned to your heart because protecting everyone else has become easier than seeking your own joy?" The sudden accuracy of his words struck her harder than any insult Thomas had ever thrown, leaving her completely speechless in the quiet hall. She had spent 6 months choosing duty over her own life, until the difference between what she wanted and what she owed had disappeared entirely. Before she could search her mind for the true answer, Gideon stepped a fraction closer, his cold fingers reaching out to touch the fabric of her sleeve. "I shall not propose to you tonight," he said, his voice low and smooth. "You deserve far better than a decision made in the shadow of a social crisis." "Then what are you asking from me?" she whispered, looking up into his dark eyes. "I am asking for your permission to court you honestly starting tomorrow morning," he replied simply. "For 2 long hours tonight, we invented a history of where we met, how we laughed, and how long we had cared for one another. I wish to discard every single invented line and keep only the small truths we told by accident under that table." Mabel looked at him for a long time, the cool night air wrapping around them as she realized the path ahead was completely new. Looking back on that winter night from the quiet porch of the grand stone house in the northern valley, Mabel realized that the future is rarely built on the grand declarations we plan for ourselves. It grows instead in the small, unscripted moments when we are forced to drop our defenses and trust another soul in the dark. The fear of being judged by the world had kept her silent for 6 long months. But Gideon's cold hand had shown her that true safety does not come from hiding our wounds from the crowd. It comes from finding someone who looks at your broken pieces and chooses to stand beside you before the story makes sense to anyone else. The white-haired king of the dark hills had given her back her voice, and in return, she had given him a warm home where the long, immortal silence could finally be broken by laughter. As the summer moon rose over the distant pines, she leaned her head against his shoulder, entirely content with the long life they had chosen to build together out of a single desperate lie.